served the imperial household for 40 years, and I have seen things that would hollow out a younger man. I have watched emperors die badly and badly prepared heirs scramble for the seals of office. I have stood in rooms where the air itself seemed to be listening, where the wrong word from the wrong courtier would have cracked the dynasty. Like a lens. I have negotiated treaties that cost me 3 nights of sleep for every paragraph, and I have arranged state funerals that required the precise coordination of 600 moving parts, any one of which could, if mishandled, constitute a diplomatic incident. I have, in short, spent my working life managing the gap between what the Empire projects and what the Empire actually is. I retired to a house on the eastern slope of Calder Voss because I wanted the quiet. I had earned the quiet, and the body. Even a body reasonably well maintained carries 40 years of sustained vigilance in the joints and in the sleep and in the quality of silence available to it when it finally stops. I wanted to be done. I got the quiet for exactly 11 days. Then the emperor died, and the court followed the young empress out to the grief palace, and I found myself in the thick of it again, because the house I had retired to happened to share a garden wall with the lower kitchens. Because 40 years in service means that, even in retirement, the younger officials come to your door at odd hours with their eyes too wide, their voices too controlled, and they say things like, "Steward Osavale 10, she still has not eaten," and then they stand there on your step, looking at you as though your 4 decades of institutional knowledge might produce, on demand, the answer to a problem that has defeated everyone else. I will tell you what I told them the first time, and the second, and the third. I told them that grief does not respond to authority. I told them that a young woman who has lost her husband of 4 years, a man she chose herself, over the objections of 3 separate advisors, a man she loved in the unguarded way that the very young sometimes manage before the court trains it, out of them. I told them that such a woman could not be argued or medicated or ceremonially coaxed back into eating. I told them to give her time. They told me the Empire did not have time. I told them the Empire would have to find some, because the alternative was forcing food on a grieving empress, under imperial medical order, and the political fallout from that particular image would outlast all of us. They went away. They came back. 11 days, the finest healers and physicians and grief counselors in the Osavale tents system sat in the outer rooms of the empresses, apartments at Calder Voss, and waited for something to give. The Empress Sorathi had not eaten in 11 days. Let me tell you about the grief palace at Calder Voss, because you need to understand what that place is before you can understand what happened in. It is not a palace in the sense that most people mean the word. It is a large, quiet, stone-floored residence set into the eastern hillside above the city, surrounded by old-growth hardwood forest that the imperial family has kept, unlogged for 200 years. The rooms are modest by imperial standards. High ceilings, yes, and good glass in the windows, and the kind of woodwork that takes 3 generations of craftsmen to produce properly. But it has none of the crystalline display of the capital, palace. No hovering light sculptures, no resonance floors that sing when the empress walks across them, no ranked galleries of courtiers in formal dress watching her every movement. At Calder Voss, the grief palace, curtains are drawn, and the light is quiet, and the air smells of wood and rain and old stone, and generations of the imperial family have come there to be somewhere other than watched. Sorathi had been 17 when she first came to Calder Voss. She had told me once, this was 3 years before her husband died, during a state visit, when I was still active, and she was still in the early, uncalloused years of her role, that it was the only place in the Empire where she could hear herself breathe. I remembered that, during those 11 days. I kept remembering it, in the way you return to a word you cannot quite translate, because you know, it means something important, and have not yet found the shape of what it means. The imperial medical establishment had sent 4 physicians. 2 were specialists in grief pathology, between them 6 decades of practice, reading the physiological and psychological aftermath of sudden loss in individuals under sustained public obligation. 1 was the Empire's foremost authority on sustained nutritional deprivation and its secondary cardiac effects, a spare, precise woman named Avransol, who had consulted on 17 similar cases across the senior nobility and had, she told me, never lost a patient to self-starvation. The fourth was a healer of the older school, what my grandmother's generation called a soul mender. The formal title was Resonance Counselor First Grade, and her name was Verithis On, and I had known her professionally for 20 years. And if I had been forced to choose one person in the Empire to place in a room with a grieving Empress and give her the best odds of succeeding, I would have chosen Verithis On. All four had been admitted to the outer apartments. None of them had gotten further than the second anteroom because the Empress had stationed her personal attendant, a young woman named Ovres, who had been with Selivethi since the Empress was 19, and who possessed in her compact frame a quantity of quiet determination I had long found admirable. In the inner doorway with standing instructions to let no one in who carried medical instruments, formal credentials, the particular expression of a person who had come to fix her. The healer's art, as it is practiced at the imperial level, is largely an art of presence and speech. These were gifted people. I do not want to diminish what they attempted. Verithis On had a voice like warm water and 40 years of practice reading the silences between words, and she had the additional quality of genuine warmth. Not performed warmth, not the technique of warmth, but the real thing, is rarer than it sounds even among people who have dedicated their professional lives to the care of others. Even she could not get Silivethi to open the inner door. The grief pathologists sent written notes. The notes were returned, unread, the seals unbroken. The nutritional specialist Avransol drafted a clinical report outlining in precise physiological terms what would happen to the Empress's cardiac tissue and renal function if she did not eat within the next 48 hours. This report was returned also. Someone, I suspected Ovres, who had a sardonic streak she kept well contained except in moments of particular frustration, had written across the cover in small, careful letters, "She knows." I was called in to consult on the third day, and again on the 6th, and again on the 9th. Each time I said the same things. Each time the officials looked at me with the focused desperation of people whose institutional frameworks have not provided for the situation they are in. I understood their desperation. The Empire functions on the premise that there is a correct procedure for every situation, and the correct procedure for a grieving Empress who has stopped eating is send the best healers. The best healers had been sent. Procedure was not working. The officials were experiencing, in real time, the discovery that their maps do not cover the territory, and there is no feeling quite like that particular discovery when you are the one responsible for the territory. On the 9th day, one of the younger court officials, a man named Thesivil, recently appointed to the household staff, eager and not yet worn to smoothness, asked me privately whether there was any precedent for the Empress being declared medically incapacitated and the Imperial Regency Council being convened. He asked it in the low, careful voice of someone who knows he is saying something he should not say, who is frightened enough to say it anyway. I told him that if I heard that question again from anyone in this palace, I would personally ensure the person asking it spent the next 6 months reviewing customs documentation in the Eastern Outpost system. He went away. The question did not come back to me. But I knew it had been asked, which meant it was being thought, which meant the institutional patience was not going to hold much longer. On the morning of the 12th day, I woke before dawn because my joints had gone stiff in the cold, the way they do now when the autumn comes in fast, and I got up and made myself tea and stood at my kitchen window that looks out over the garden wall into the lower courtyard of the Grief Palace. Kitchens. The courtyard was dark except for the working lights over the scullery door. The breakfast staff would not arrive for another 2 hours, but there was a single light moving in the lower kitchen. The old stone scullery, where the rough work gets done, peeling and chopping, and the stock boiling, and after a moment I recognized the shape of the man who was moving inside it. His name was Vethara. I had noticed him 2 weeks before, during the initial chaos of the court's arrival at Calder Voss, when I was still being consulted about logistics and had occasion to walk through the lower service areas. He was on the refugee labor rolls, one of perhaps 30 laborers hired from the Venerath transit camp that sits outside the city on the North Road, people who had been displaced by the border troubles in the western reaches and were waiting on resettlement permits. The Grief Palace at Calder Voss uses transit labor for the lower kitchen work during full court residences when the regular staff cannot manage the volume alone. The transit workers are hired on short contracts. They sleep in the outbuildings. They are fed from the staff kitchen, and they are not, under any ordinary circumstances, permitted above the ground floor. Vethera was in his late 50s. He was not tall. He had the dense, economical compactness of a man who has moved heavy things in confined spaces for a long time and whose body has organized itself around that fact quietly and without drama. His hands were arthritic. I noticed this at a distance. In the careful adjusted grip of some compensating for joints that no longer close all the way, an adjustment made so long it read not as difficulty but as habit. He had a face that time had worked on thoroughly, deep lines at the eyes, around the mouth, the weathering of outdoor work over many years, and pale gray eyes that I had not yet had occasion to see express very much of anything. Before the border troubles he had been, as far as I could determine from the transit documentation, farm laborer and occasional field medic. The Venerath lowlands had a tradition of workers doubling as community healers, not trained in the formal sense, but trained in the practical sense of communities too isolated for regular medical access. Someone needed to know how to set a bone and treat an infection and recognize when a fever was the kind that would pass and when it was the kind that would not. He had that background, which had been noted on his labor intake form under secondary skills, and had not been of any particular interest to the palace kitchen, which had assigned him to stock work, chopping, boiling, washing, the kind of labor that keeps a kitchen running and that no one above a certain rank in the hierarchy ever has to think about. I watched him in the scullery window for a few minutes, without quite knowing why. He was making porridge. Not the elaborate morning porridge that would go out to the court's breakfast tables. That was a different recipe, a formal recipe, with imported grain and 3 kinds of dried fruit, and a caramelized glaze that took 20 minutes, and was plated with the kind of architectural precision that the upper kitchen supervisor, a man named Tessavel, required of everything that left his floor. This was plain porridge, lentil-based, from the look of it, cooked down with what appeared to be the stock water from the previous night's dried lentil preparation rather than fresh water, with a little oil heated in the bottom of the pot first, and a pinch of dried herb that I could not identify from my window but that smelled, on the cold morning air coming through the gap in my window frame, like the dried sage that grows on the hillsides above Calder Voss, and that you can pick yourself in any season if you walk up the slope behind the palace. He made a single bowl. He did not make breakfast for anyone else. He took the bowl, covered it with a folded cloth to hold the warmth, tucked it under one arm with the careful compensating grip I had noted before, and left the scullery. I put on my coat and followed him. He went up the back stairs. The old stone servants' stairs run along the inside of the palace's north wall, cut into the living rock of the hillside. Lit by small wall-mounted lights, the maintenance staff replaces only when they actually fail. The stairs are narrow and cold, and they smell of stone and damp, and the mineral darkness of the hill above, the smell of places that see little sun and much time. I had walked them myself 40 years ago, when I was a junior steward who had not yet earned the right to use the main corridors. I was surprised that Thara knew they existed. The transit laborers are generally not shown the upper floor access routes. They are oriented to the ground floor, the service areas, the outbuildings, expected to remain within those zones. I believe he must have explored quietly during the days before the court arrived in full. A man who is observant and unhurried will find things that the officially guided orientation misses. He came out on the 2nd floor, where the private apartments are, and he walked down the corridor to the door of the Empress's library. He did not knock. He stood in front of the door for a moment, not hesitating in the way of someone uncertain, more the way a man stands before doing something he has already decided to do, and is simply gathering the physical moment for it. Then he turned the handle and went in. I should not have let him get that far. I am aware of this. I was watching from the end of the corridor, and I was close enough to call out, close enough to move, and I did neither. I have asked myself why many times since, and the answer I keep arriving at is this. I had watched 4 of the finest healers in the Empire fail to get through that door over 11 days, and this arthritic refugee cook from the transit camp had simply walked in, and I wanted, with a curiosity that was considerably stronger than my professional instincts, to see what happened next. 40 years of institutional management does not entirely kill the part of a person that is just curious. I walked down the corridor and stood outside the library door, which he had left slightly ajar. The library at Calder Voss is a long room. Wall is the window wall. Tall windows, facing, that look out at the forest and in good wet weather catch the light off the hillside in the afternoon, though in morning residence the curtains are traditionally half-drawn, and the afternoon light comes in as a soft, diffuse warmth rather than direct sun. The other 3 walls are shelves floor to ceiling, the old-style carved wood shelves that the second emperor had installed, and that nobody has ever replaced because they are perfectly good, and also because certain things in grief palaces are not changed, both for practical reasons and for the reason that constancy, in a place built for grief, is itself a form of care. There is a reading table in the center of the room, low, the kind that invites you to sit on the floor around it, rather than in a chair. There are 2 long benches along the window wall, padded in dark fabric. There is a large woven rug that covers most of the stone floor, old and slightly faded, with the kind of warmth underfoot that new rugs do not have, and there are lamps at each end of the room that run on a very slow, warm dimmer that the court staff had been keeping at its lowest setting since the Empress arrived, so that the library was lit at all times by the quality of light that exists just before dark, when the day has not quite given up. Sorathi was sitting on the floor near the window. Not on the bench, on the floor itself, back against the wall, below the window, and her knees drawn up and her arms resting across them, in a posture that was not dramatic, not theatrical, not performed. She was simply sitting on the floor in the way that a person sits when they have run out of reasons to sit anywhere more purposeful. She was in her private morning dress, a dark, plain-cut garment without ornament, the kind of thing the imperial family wears when there are no witnesses and no ceremony required. Her hair was loose. She had not been sleeping well. I could see that from the door, in the quality of stillness she had, which was the stillness of exhaustion rather than the stillness of rest. Eyes were open, looking at nothing in particular, in the way that eyes look when the mind has retreated somewhere the body cannot follow, and the body is simply waiting. She was 26 years old. She looked younger and older than that simultaneously, which grief will do, is one of grief's few consistencies across species and cultures, and the centuries of recorded human and alien experience that I have read and that have not ultimately produced any reliable method for making it shorter. Vethara crossed the room. He crossed it without hurry, without announcement, without the particular quality of movement that people adopt when they are entering a space they are not sure they are welcome. In the slowing, the checking, the small signaling gestures of uncertainty, he crossed it the way he had walked up the corridor, with the even, deliberate, economical gait of a man going somewhere he intends to go. He set the bowl down on the floor about an arm's length from her. He did not offer it to her. He did not say what it was or who it was for. He simply set it down, in a place she could reach, without effort if she chose to reach for it, and then he sat down on the floor himself, not beside her, not crowding her, not positioning himself in the careful therapeutic way of someone trained in proximity management, but a comfortable few body lengths away, the distance at which 2 people can be in the same room without being in each other's space. He sat the way he walked, without drama, his hands rested in his lap, the arthritic knuckles visible in the low light, the old calluses catching the lamp warmth. He said nothing. She said nothing. She did not look at the bowl. After perhaps 4 minutes she looked at him. Just a look. The direct, neutral look of someone who has noticed an unexpected thing in their space and is assessing, without hostility, what it is going to do. Eyes moved from his face to his hands to the bowl and back to his face. He looked back at her. His expression was not careful. It was not trained. It was not performing sympathy or warmth or compassion or any of the other things that the people who had been trying to reach her for 11 days had with genuine skill and genuine intention, been performing. He looked the way a man looks when he is simply present in a room and has nowhere else to be and no particular agenda about it. His expression was the expression of his hands, used, unhurried, plain. She looked away again. Back at the window, he continued to say nothing. After 6 minutes, I counted, standing in the corridor with one hand on the door frame and the cold of the stone coming up through the soles of my shoes. He stood up. He picked up the bowl which she had not touched. He covered it again with the folded cloth, tucked it back under his arm with the adjusted grip of his arthritic hands, and walked out of the library, pulling the door softly behind him. He passed me in the corridor without surprise, which told me he had been aware I was there the whole time. He nodded, the small, flat nod of a man acknowledging a colleague in a hallway, and went back down the back stairs without a word. I stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then I went back to my house and sat with my cold tea and thought about what I had seen. The following morning, at the same hour, he made one bowl of the same porridge in the scullery. I watched from my window. Then I went upstairs. He came through the library door. He set the bowl down in the same place. He sat in the same place. She said nothing. He said nothing. And after 6 minutes, he picked up the bowl and left. The morning after that, the same. And the morning after that. And the morning after that. On the 5th morning, I noticed that he had put a small sprig of hillside sage across the rim of the bowl, not as decoration, not arranged, not placed with any ceremony. The way you might put a familiar object near a frightened animal, not as an offering but as a signal. Someone has paid attention to what is nearby. Someone knows what grows on this hillside. Someone has been here before. By this time, I was aware that I should have reported what was happening. The Imperial medical staff were still in residence and still waiting for some break in the Empress's withdrawal. And what I had been quietly watching for 4 mornings was, technically, an unauthorized transit laborer accessing restricted areas of the Imperial private apartments without permission or escort, or even the basic clearance required to operate above the ground floor. There was a protocol for this. There was a specific protocol, with specific consequences. And I had spent 4 decades enforcing protocols, because protocols exist for reasons, and the reasons are usually good even when the specific application of them produces results that are not. I did not report him. I do not fully know why, except that I had been managing institutions for 40 years, and I had developed, over that time, a sense for the moments when the institution is the wrong instrument. A sense for when the protocol is going to make things worse. You cannot write that sense into a procedure manual. It accumulates in you the way all long experience accumulates, not as a set of rules you can recite, but as a weight you feel when you are about to do something that will set the wrong thing in motion. The weight is not always reliable. I have felt it and been wrong. But I felt it very clearly when I thought about reporting Vithara, and the clarity of it was the kind I had learned 40 years to take seriously. On the 7th morning, I was at my position in the corridor, and I heard, for the first time, the sound of movement from inside the library before Vithara left, specifically, the small, particular sound of a ceramic bowl being lifted from a stone floor. He came out of the library with the bowl empty. He passed me in the corridor. He did not change his expression or his pace. He nodded in the same way he always nodded and went down the stairs. I stood in the corridor for a long time. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say the bowl was empty, because there are kinds of empty and they matter. She had not finished the porridge. She had eaten perhaps a third of it. And the physiological level that the nutritional specialist had been tracking would have been enough. Enough to interrupt the cascade that Avransal had described in her clinical report, enough to take the most urgent near-term dangers off the immediate table. I do not think that is what mattered about the empty bowl. What mattered was the fact of it, that something had moved, that the bowl, which had sat in the same place for 6 consecutive mornings, had been touched by the person it had been set down for. The Empire, if it had known, sent in the physicians immediately. I want you to understand this. The natural institutional response to that empty bowl would have been, the door is open now, the barrier has shifted, send the professionals through while the opening exists. The resonance counselor could go in. The grief pathologist could go in. The full weight of the imperial healing establishment, which had been waiting for 11 going on 12 days for exactly this kind of sign, could go in and do what it had been sent to do. I made the decision that it would not. I went to the outer apartments, and I told the medical staff that the Empress had shown some improvement in her patterns overnight, and that she had expressed a wish for quiet for another week before receiving any visitors. This was partially true. Her attendant ogress had mentioned to me, 2 days earlier, that the Empress seemed to be sleeping in slightly longer stretches, and partially a fabrication that I delivered with the full, unhurried authority of 40 years in service, and a tone that did not invite follow-up questions. The physicians accepted it. They were tired. They had been at Calder Voss for 12 days, sleeping in the guest rooms, eating the formal kitchen's breakfasts, waiting in the particular exhausting suspension of people whose professional purpose is being deferred indefinitely. The residence counselor, Verethasan, looked me for a long, careful moment with the attention of someone who has spent 40 years reading what is being said. And then she nodded and said she would be available when the Empress was ready. I thanked her. I thanked all of them. I meant it. I went back to my house. I sat down. My tea was cold again. I was not entirely certain I had done the right thing. I was fairly certain I had done the necessary thing, which in my experience are not the same thing, and do not pretend to be. The mornings continued. He came at the same hour every day, before the kitchen staff arrived. In the window of time between the night and the working dawn, when the palace is quietest. He made the same bowl of lentil porridge. I watched from my window, and I had begun, without deciding to notice the small variations. The day he added something red and dried to the pot that I could not identify from the color, but that changed the smell of the porridge to something warmer, richer, with a depth I associated with the dried spice root you could buy from the Venerath traders in the city market. The day he brewed a small pot of grainbark tea and set it beside the bowl, the particular tea of the Venerath lowlands, the kind that tastes like wood smoke and dry grass, and takes some getting used to if you did not grow up with it. The day the sage sprig on the rim was longer than usual, and still carried a small, late flower because it was the week of the hillside blooming, and if you walked far enough up the slope behind the palace, you could find the sage in its last flowering before the winter came down. He did not vary the timing. He did not vary the route. He did not, as far as I could observe, do anything differently on any of those mornings except what the morning itself suggested. The available herb, the available spice, the temperature of the air that might make tea the right companion to porridge. He was not trying to make it interesting. He was just making it. She ate. Not always all of it. Not always quickly. I could tell from the weight of the bowl when he came out, the days when she had barely touched it, and the days when she had eaten more than usual, and the days which came more frequently as the weeks passed, when the bowl came out noticeably lighter. But she ate. On the 17th morning, I arrived in the corridor to find the library door open wider than usual. Not ajar. Open, and I heard for the first time voices. I did not go closer. I stood at the corridor junction and listened, and what I heard was this. A woman's voice, low, saying something I could not fully make out. 3 or 4 words, a question by the cadence, and then Vithara's voice that I had not heard at any length before, and which was exactly what I should have expected from his face and his hands, and the general economy of him, plain, unhurried, with the particular flattened vowels of the Venerath lowland dialect, the accent of a region that is far from the capital, and has never particularly tried to sound otherwise, he said, and this I could hear clearly. My wife made it with goat's milk on the cold mornings. I don't have goat's milk here. I've been using the water from the dried lentils. It's thicker than plain water. It holds the heat longer anyway. A pause. Then her voice, still low but audible. Is that how they make it in Venerath? Some do, he said. My wife's mother taught her. She said, the lentil water was better than plain water, but not as good as milk. And since we almost never had goat's milk on the farm, we made do with the lentil water. And after a while, it was just the way it tasted. You stopped thinking about the milk. It was just the porridge. Another pause. Longer. The wind moved in the forest outside the window.
How long have you been widowed?
She asked. 9 years, he said. I went back to the corridor junction and leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a while. In the way you look at a ceiling when you have just been given something to hold that needs to be held carefully. 9 years. He had been carrying 9 years of that particular knowledge, the specific, non-negotiable arithmetic of a person-shaped absence, of waking up to a room that is the same room, and a morning that is the same morning, except for the one element that makes all the other elements. Provisional. Through the border troubles and the transit camp and the refugee rolls and the lower kitchens of a grief palace he had been hired to peel vegetables in. He had not mentioned it. He had not used it. He had not, as the resonance counselor had been trained to do, offered it as a credential or a point of connection or a therapeutic bridge across which the grieving person might be encouraged to walk. He had just made the porridge the same way every morning and sat on the floor and said nothing. And on the 17th day, she had asked him about goat's milk, and he had told her the truth about his wife. This is the thing that none of the imperial healers could have given her. Not because they lacked skill. They did not lack skill. They were the best the empire had. And I want to be plain about that because it matters to be plain about it. They lacked one specific thing. They were there in service of an outcome. Even the resonance counselor, with her genuine warmth and her 40 years of practice, was there in a professional capacity, which meant that underneath everything, underneath the warmth, underneath the genuine care, underneath the sincere desire to see this particular young woman stop suffering, there was the structural fact of her role. She was there to produce a recovery. Sorathi knew this. Sorathi, who was 26 and grieving, and had grown up inside the most managed institution in the empire, had been surrounded her entire life by people who were there to perform a service, and she could feel the shape of it. Even when the performance was skilled and sincere, the way you can feel the walls of a room in the dark. Not by sight, but by the way the air changes when something is close. Vithara was not there to produce a recovery. He was there because he had made a bowl of porridge and carried it up a back staircase and sat on a floor, and whatever had moved in him to do that. The 9 years of his own experience, the recognition of something he had seen before, the simple decision of a man who knows what it looks like when someone cannot eat and knows the only honest response to it is to make food and put it within reach and then not leave. None of that was in service of an outcome. He had no institutional investment in whether she recovered. He had no report to write afterward. He was not going to be promoted or commended or held responsible. He was a transit laborer whose contract would expire in 6 months and who would go back to the camp. And eventually, if the permits came through, to whatever remained of the Venerath farms near the secondary delta. The Empress's recovery was not his problem to solve. He had just decided, for reasons that I suspect were simpler and more direct than anything the institutional framework could have arrived at on its own, that he would do this one thing. The mornings continued for 4 months after that first conversation. Not pretend I know everything that was said in that library over those 4 months, because I stopped standing in the corridor after the conversation about goat's milk. I felt with some clarity that I had been present for something I had not been invited to, and that my continued surveillance was no longer the necessary oversight it had been. In the early days, they had found their way to something, and it was not my place to attend it. I know, because Overis told me, she had, over time, developed a guarded respect for Vithara that expressed itself in brief, flat summaries delivered across the garden wall. With the economy of a person, trusts you enough to tell you what you need to know, and not more than that. That the Empress began getting up earlier to be in the library, before he arrived. Not much earlier, half an hour perhaps, enough to be there first, which told me something about what the mornings had become for her. I know that the single bowl became, around the 2nd month, 2 bowls. She had started making tea herself on the small brazier in the library corner, the formal blend that the palace stocked, not the Venerath grain bark. And she offered him a cup with it on a morning when the cold came in particularly hard off the hillside. I know that she asked him about Venerath. Not in the diplomatic way she would have asked about a territory, not as an empress gathering information about a region of her empire, but directly, the way a person asks another person about where they came from, when they are actually curious about the answer. I know that he told her about the lowland farms and the border troubles, and what it had been like to pack what he could carry and walk north for 3 weeks with a group of 60 people. He told her about the transit camp, the conditions, the waiting, particular suspended quality of a life that is between the life it was and the life it will be when the permits come through, and how you fill the time in that suspension if you are the kind of person who does not manage idleness well. He told her about the field medic work he had done in the community before the troubles, basic practical medicine of people too far from formal care to wait for it, and about the winter his wife had been ill and he had understood, in a very direct and personal way, the limits of what that practical knowledge could do and what it could not. I know that she told him things too. Do not know what, specifically. Overus did not tell me and I did not ask, and that is as it should be. What I know is what I could observe from the outside. She began eating the formal meals again. Not all of them, not with enthusiasm, consistently, which was what the nutritional specialist had been waiting for. She began appearing in the outer apartments for the scheduled visits from senior court officials, the ones that the business of the empire could not indefinitely defer. She began slowly to tea of effort that looks from the outside like competence, but that anyone who has watched it closely knows is something harder than competence. She began the work of becoming the empress who governed, rather than the empress who had been a wife. None of the credit for this went to the right place. The imperial medical establishment, when the improvement became visible, naturally attributed it to the protocols that had been in place. The resonance counselor, Varithus On, was thanked and sent home with a formal letter of imperial appreciation. The grief pathologist wrote a paper. The nutritional specialist Avrin Saul filed her report with an addendum noting the patient's eventual return to adequate nutritional intake. Nobody in the formal record mentioned the lentil porridge. Nobody mentioned the back stairs or the library floor or the conversations about goat's milk and Venerath farms. I allowed this to happen because the alternative required explaining how long I had known about Vethara and why I had not reported him, and I was a retired crown steward with a pension and a reputation that could sustain one significant judgment call, but was not built to withstand an inquiry into it. I am not proud of this calculation. I am honest about it because honesty is what I have left. In retirement, that costs me nothing to give. But there was also this I understood, in a way the institution could not have understood on its own, that naming Vethara in the official record would have been its own kind of harm. To name him formally, as a person who had succeeded where the imperial healers failed. To commend him, to note him in the medical history of the Empress's recovery, to give him a title or a formal recognition, to make of him an instrument of imperial recovery, would have been to make him, retroactively, part of the system that had failed her. It would have transformed the plain lentil porridge and the floor sitting and the silence and the 9 years he carried quietly in his chest into a technique, a method, a case study for the next Imperial Journal paper on grief intervention. And the whole reason it worked, the only reason it worked, was that it was not a technique. It was just a man doing the thing that seemed right to do. This is the distinction that takes 40 years to learn and that I am not certain can be taught. On the day Vethara's labor contract expired, it was 6 months to the day from when he had first walked through the library door I was in, the lower courtyard when he came out of the outbuildings, carrying the canvas bag that was, as far as I could tell, everything he owned. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and said something to Tessavel, the upper kitchen supervisor, which made Tessavel stand for a moment, with the particular stillness of a man receiving something he does not quite know how to process. Then Vethara crossed the courtyard and stopped in front of me. "Steward," he said. "Vethara," I said. He was quiet for a moment, looking past me toward the hillside. The morning was the clear, sharp autumn clear that Calder Voss gets when the night has pulled all the haze out of the air and the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look cut precisely to its own exact shape, the kind of morning that the Grief Palace sees. Best because the hillside trees hold the light differently when they are going into their color. "Porridge," I said, "after your wife. Was that something you decided to do, or did it just happen?" He thought about this with the same quality of unhurried attention he brought to everything. It just seemed like the right thing, he said. She wasn't eating. I know what that looks like. I know what the mornings look like in the first years. You didn't think about. I stopped, tried again. You're a transit laborer. You walked into the private apartments of the Empress of the Osavale 10 system. I know what that is, he said, which was not precisely a response to what I had said, but which was, I thought, entirely sufficient. I looked at him. He looked back with those pale gray eyes that had declined, over 6 months, to offer me anything that was not simply and plainly what was there. Where will you go? I asked. The transit camp has a longer-term residency block for people waiting on Western resettlement, he said. My permit should come through by spring. There are farms near the Venerthus secondary delta that are rebuilding. Someone who knows kitchen work and some basic medicine can find use there. If the permit is slow, I said, and then I stopped. Because I was about to say something about the contacts I had, the people I knew in the resettlement office, calls I could make with one conversation, and a letter on the right stationery. He looked at me with a slight tilt of his head, and I understood that he was not asking for anything. If the permit is slow, I said again, come and knock on my door. He nodded, that same small, flat nod, and picked up his bag and walked to the courtyard gate. I stood and watched him go through the gate and turn up the road that leads away. Calder Voss toward the city and the transit camp. He did not look back. Not because he was being cold about it, not as a deliberate exit, simply because he was a man walking somewhere he needed to go, and looking back was not at that moment the relevant direction. I turned back toward the face of the palace, and I looked up at its gray stone, the tall windows of the private apartments, the second-floor library with its north-facing glass and its half-drawn curtains. She was standing at the window, quite still, arms at her sides, looking down the road where Vethara had turned. She was still in her morning dress. She was standing upright in a way she had not been standing when she first arrived at Calder Voss. The upright of a woman who has weight in her, legs again who has decided to bear what needs to be borne. The light was on her face. She watched until the road was empty of him. I do not know how long she stood there after that. I went inside because my joints were stiffening in the cold, and because I had been a crown steward for 40 years, and I knew when something was not my business to witness any further, and when to remove myself from it with whatever dignity was still available to an old man in a cold courtyard. I have thought about Vethara often in the years since. I do not know if his resettlement permit came through by spring. I know, from a call I eventually made to the resettlement office, quietly, as a private inquiry, not as anything official, that his file was marked cleared and complete, means he was not still waiting at the camp the last time his case was reviewed. Beyond that, I cannot say. What I can say is this. In 40 years of serving the imperial household, I watched a great many skilled and well-intentioned people attempt to reach a great many important individuals in their worst moments. Some of them succeeded and most of them did not, and the ones who succeeded were not always the most skilled, and were not always the most credentialed, and were not always the most senior. What they had when it worked was the particular quality that Vethara had in abundance, and that cannot be manufactured and cannot be credentialed, and cannot be sent for when you realize you need it. They were not there to fix anything. They were just there. He knew what it was to sit in the silence of a room that used to have someone in it. He knew the specific weight of the morning. In those first years, when you wake and the absence is still there, and you have to decide again whether you are going to eat. He knew, because he had lived it for 9 years with his arthritic hands and his canvas bag and his 3 soups, that the decision to eat is not dramatic. It does not require an occasion. It does not require the presence of a skilled professional or a clinical report or a formal intervention plan. Just requires someone who will be there, same time, same bowl, saying nothing, asking nothing. Patient in the particular way of someone who knows that patience is not waiting. Patience is just being present without demanding a return on it. This is the thing the Empire could not teach its healers, because the Empire is built on return. Every physician it sent to Calder Voss was there in service of a return, the Empress's recovery, the Empire's stability. the continuation of the dynasty, and even, in the most generous reading, the genuine desire to see a young woman stop suffering, is its own kind of expectation. The return does not have to be selfish to still be a return. It just has to be present in the room, as an invisible structuring fact underneath everything else. And the person you are trying to reach will feel it even when they cannot name it. Bathara had nothing to return to and nothing to return on. He had a canvas bag and a transit contract and a bowl of porridge and the knowledge, carried forward 9 years from a farmhouse in the Venerath lowlands, of what it felt like when someone sat beside you in the morning, without requiring anything of the morning. He gave her that, without the institution's permission, without a credential or a title or a formal appointment, without any particular plan other than the instinct of a man who recognized something he had seen before and knew, experience, rather than training, the only honest response to it. The Empire will not record this. The Empire records the Resonance Counselor's letter of appreciation and the grief pathologist's journal paper and the nutritional specialist's clinical addendum. The Empire records the recovery of Empress Sulavethi in the 6th month of the imperial mourning residence at Calder Voss, attributed to the sustained and professional efforts of the imperial medical establishment over that period. I am a retired crown steward, with a house on the eastern slope and a cold tea habit, and 40 years of seeing the distance between what the Empire says happened and what actually happened. I am recording this here because someone should. The bowl was plain lentil porridge, made in an old stone scullery before dawn, by a man with arthritic hands who knew what the morning looks like when someone you loved used to be in it. He carried it up a back staircase and set it on the floor of a library beside a young woman who had stopped eating, and he sat with her in silence. And he came back the next morning and did it again and again and again for 6 months until she did not need him to anymore. Then he picked up his canvas bag and walked out the gate and did not look back. That is what happened. That is all of it. That is the whole truth of it, and it is more than enough.